Good afternoon. My name is Margot Kushel, and I am the director of the UCSF Benioff Homelessness and Housing Initiative. BHHI generates evidence-based solutions to prevent and end homelessness. You can learn more about us on our website. UCSF BHHI recently released a topic brief about unsheltered homelessness, along with an encampment resolution guide and prioritization tool. You can download them from our website. We're going to just touch on our report and prioritization tools today, and we really encourage you to read and share and engage with our material. Today's webinar will discuss the crisis of unsheltered homelessness, people living outdoors, in vehicles, or in spaces not meant for human habitation. The visibility and devastating outcomes of unsheltered homelessness drives much of the public conversation surrounding homelessness today. People living in unsheltered settings are forced to live their private lives in public. In California, 78% of adults experiencing homelessness do so in unsheltered settings. The recent Supreme Court decision in Grants Pass v. Johnson has changed the policy landscape around unsheltered homelessness, allowing jurisdictions to act, to cite or arrest people for sleeping in unsheltered settings, even if there are no other options. Due to the impact of structural racism, those experiencing homelessness and unsheltered homelessness are disproportionately people of color, thus raising additional concerns about the disproportionate and racialized impact of this decision. Since the decision, we have seen many jurisdictions announcing changes in their strategies. Our focus today will be on exploring solutions to addressing unsheltered homelessness in a way that preserves health, dignity, and civil rights for those experiencing it. In today's webinar, our panelists will discuss findings, public health impact, and local experience. Then we will have a roundtable discussion focused on solutions, including a Q&A with you, our audience. Our panelists today are Marc Dones. Marc Dones is a policy director at UCSF BHHI. They are a social justice advocate and policy strategist and have worked extensively in the fields of violence prevention, homelessness, affordable housing, and racial equity. Ashley Meehan is a health scientist at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, serving as the agency's lead scientist for homelessness and health. And Carter Hewgley is Senior Director for the Homeless Initiative at Los Angeles County Chief Executive's Office, where he oversees a joint emergency response to homelessness and directs housing-focused encampment resolution partnerships. Thank you to all the panelists for joining us today. Marc Dones is going to start us off. Welcome, Marc.
Thanks, Margot, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to talk a little bit about our topic brief data and also about the tools that we put out just to ground us for today's conversation. So as Margot mentioned, 78% of California's population experiencing homelessness is unsheltered, and 72% of the folks who are unsheltered are folks of color, which highlights the continued impact of structural racism, particularly on Black and Indigenous communities. Unsheltered homelessness has two main types, folks who are living in unsheltered conditions or conditions not fit for human habitation, and folks living in vehicles. 57% of folks experiencing unsheltered homelessness were unsheltered outdoors, and 21% were in a vehicle. The median age for folks experiencing unsheltered homelessness is 47. Again, 72% are folks of color, and 93% are single adults. Importantly, and I think this gets to the heart of what we want to talk about today, folks described a lot of frequent contact with police and government agencies, which often precipitated the loss of essential belongings. So 45% of folks living outdoors and 32% of folks living in vehicles have had their belongings taken by a government agency or police in the last 6 months. And 52% of all unsheltered folks experienced being roughed up by the police during their current episode of homelessness. Many people wanted shelter and could not access it, and I think that's really important when we talk about a lot of the narratives that drive the public discourse, right? Many of which are not true. So 45% of people living outdoors and 31% of those living in vehicles reported wanting shelter but not being able to access it at some point during their experience of homelessness. What that points to is a problem with making shelter readily available. And so one of the things that we really want to dig into, both today and then broadly over the next several months, is thinking about how to improve shelter utilization rates as being the key to solving unsheltered homelessness. When we think about how jurisdictions can approach that, we want to isolate a couple key metrics and then use those to drive change. So one is the average length of stay in shelters. The second is the median length of stay in shelters, the total number of people experiencing homelessness in the jurisdiction, and then the proportion of the folks who are experiencing homelessness who are unsheltered. Using those metrics in concert, we can think about how to drive up our shelter utilization so that our beds can actually assist more people. That's a way of essentially increasing the amount of shelter available in a community without having to build new shelter. It's really important that communities think really carefully about whether or not they need to invest in the construction of new shelter or the construction of new housing. And using these metrics is a great way to think about which is the right one to prioritize. As Margot mentioned, we also put out two tools, an encampment resolution guide and a tool on how to prioritize encampments for engagement. So what is encampment resolution? It's a coordinated multi-system strategy that addresses the impacts of unsheltered homelessness and focuses on housing people and using shelter only when housing placement is not available. This is not the same as offering people shelter placements that are inadequate and then declined and then displacing them, also called sweeps. Encampment resolution is a five-part process that begins with identification, where we, look to see which or where encampments are in the community. Then we assess those encampments. Then we plan around how to bring people inside. We draw down, right? That's moving folks inside, and then following up to prevent re-encampment of the site. The team that's responsible for a lot of this activity is the core strategy team. Core strategy teams are typically made up of a group of folks. Here are some key, agencies or organizations that you want to have represented. So continuum of care leadership, housing focused service providers, an outreach lead agency, property owners, right? Whoever owns the property that the encampment is sited on, a law enforcement representative. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but really encourage folks to read the resolution guide. There's a whole section on how to work cooperatively with law enforcement in a way that doesn't lead to overcriminalization, punishment, or incarceration. Mitigation partners, those are folks who are going to address the site after folks have moved out. And then a Parks Department representative if needed, other impacted partners if needed, and a health services representative, again, if needed. So when we talk about how to prioritize encampments, right? So this is what happens when we identify. So we're going to look at a couple key things. Population needs, where we're going to focus on the age, medical need, behavioral health need, and limitations on activities of daily living. I really want to lift up, right, that like we're not looking at any one individual in the encampment, but rather the number of folks in the encampment as a whole that fall into these categories, right? So we're trying to understand a sort of mini population level vulnerability rather than just individual vulnerabilities, right? That's a slightly different approach than what we often do, right? Which is we use coordinated entry to drive this sort of individual look at people. But when we think about encampments, we're thinking about a group, right, that need to be considered collectively. We also want to look at disorder. So for disorder, we think about sexual violence, physical violence, uncontrolled fires, and conflict. For public health, we think about infestation and infectious disease. For location, we think about proximity to sensitive use, any ADA concerns, environmental concerns, challenges to frequent public use, construction zone, dangers, a danger to encampment residents, and a department access issue. And then for geographic targeting, jurisdictions may choose to prioritize certain locations, e.g. downtown, near schools, near critical infrastructure, and that may feed into how they think about prioritization. Importantly, I want to be really clear here, and the prioritization tool goes into this in more depth, but the data sources for these are really important. And so the vast majority of these need to be confirmed from either outreach workers, encampment residents, or a relevant government agency via interdepartmental memo. We don't accept just, calls from the general public. While those calls may alert us to an issue, we always want to make sure that there's a validated data source that underpins our decision to say, yes, there is uncontrolled fire here, right? And we know that because we heard it from the fire department. When we talk about public health and dangers to encampment residents, those trigger two specific protocols. So if an encampment is a danger to residents, we call that a hazard protocol, right? And that's when the site creates an extreme risk of death or severe harm for the residents. So examples of that might be highway or freeway on and off ramps, encampments that are in the path of wildfires or other active natural disasters, or on floodplains during rainy seasons. Public health protocols are activated when an encampment is suspected of having a significant infestation or significant infectious disease. Examples there are body lice, rats, mice, other rodents, or diseases like Shigella tuberculosis, Hep A, or COVID-19. When a public health protocol is activated, we immediately cease resolution activities and bring in the relevant public health authority or health services agency to evaluate the situation and advise us on what to do next. The last thing we want to do is spread, either an infestation or disease across the community, right? And oftentimes we need to contain it and treat people on the site in order to make sure that we don't. When a hazard protocol is activated, what that means is that that encampment becomes our priority first, right? So we need to make sure that those folks are out of harm's way and not going to be exposed to, that severe risk of death or harm. And so that encampment jumps to the top of our prioritization list, and we bring those folks inside quickly. So the whole process looks like this. I won't belabor this again. You can see this in the guide, but we identify folks. There's a form that we use to do our initial prioritization assessment. It then goes into pool 1, pool 2, or pool 3, and then it goes into a secondary assessment for encampment characteristics I'll talk about in a moment, and then is either classed for immediate resolution, pre-resolution, or site stabilization. So assessment, we look at domains and characteristics of the encampment that are going to help us know what resources we need to deploy to successfully bring folks inside. So we look at things like organization, that's group cohesion, whether or not the encampment is self-managed, right? So do people have a governing structure, right? A lot of encampments I've worked with, there is a leader, right? They take votes on things, they make decisions collectively. And then to what degree has the encampment been engaged by providers? Is it an encampment that has a strong relationship with a set of outreach workers, or are these folks who are mostly sort of doing their own thing? We look at size, so that's just the number of people. Population, we look at needs. That's pulling down some of that information from our earlier assessment on the vulnerabilities that folks have. And then we also look at number and type of pets. Equity factors, so encampments that have significant percentages of Black folks, Latino or Latinx folks, Native or Indigenous residents, LGBTQ identifying, or female identifying. And then complexity, so that's type of structures, right? Are we looking at mostly tents? Have people begun to build stuff? Have they built very complex structures? And then are there vehicles involved, right? Is it mostly a vehicle-based encampment, or is there just sort of one RV? And then density. Is it very tightly packed, or is it spread out over a large parcel of land? The timeline for resolution, not including mitigation or post-site activation, is typically 6 to 8 weeks. And I really want to be clear about this because oftentimes folks are under really unrealistic timelines. And one of the first things to successfully resolving an encampment is adjusting our timelines, right? And communicating really clearly, both internally to our stakeholders who are our government and, sort of outreach partners, and then also externally to the public, how long it's going to take, right? We don't want to tell people it's going to take a week and then it takes 4. We don't want to tell people it's going to take 2 weeks and then it takes 8, right? So we really want to make sure that we give ourselves enough time. I had a boss who used to tell me frequently, right? You want to overpromise, or sorry, you want to, underpromise, overdeliver. That's what it was. And so in this case, right, it's better, right, to say, hey, our standard operating procedure is roughly 8 weeks. And then if it takes 4, everyone is pleasantly surprised, right? Large encampments may take longer. For example, one resolution I worked on with about 90 people took about 10 weeks. And timelines should be adapted according to the size of an encampment and the overall complexity of the needs amongst the residents. That was a lot. We'll talk about it more, but certainly if folks want to follow up, feel free to email me or Margot. We're happy to set up time to talk with you, your community, and how you might begin to adopt some of these tools or use some of this data to inform your approach around unsheltered homelessness. Thanks everyone for being here today. And I'm going to pass it to Ashley.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Meehan, and I am CDC's lead scientist for homelessness and health. I sit within CDC's Office of Readiness and Response, and today I'll offer a bit of framing on encampments and public health. So here's the bottom line. Involuntary displacement is not an effective or sustainable solution to unsheltered homelessness. The solutions are permanent housing and addressing the upstream root causes to prevent homelessness from occurring in the first place. So it's important that I clarify that not all actions or efforts to close encampments are the same. I use the term involuntary displacement. Others sometimes use terminology like encampment sweeps. When I say involuntary displacement, I am referring to the forceful dislocation of people sleeping outside without their consent and without providing suitable and adequate alternate living arrangements or services. Involuntary displacement, as I talk about it, also often includes little to no advanced warning of an encampment closure, minimal engagement with people living in an encampment beforehand, and destruction of property and belongings. Now, there are communities engaging in trauma-informed and humane encampment resolution, providing support and housing to people living in an encampment, and that's not what I'm talking about when I say involuntary displacement. So where does public health fit into this discussion? Well, public health concerns are often used to justify involuntary displacement and encampment sweeps. When people are living unsheltered or in encampments, there are very real risks to health that warrant attention and prevention. These include things like concerns around sanitation, drug use, pedestrian vehicle injuries, violence and safety, exposure to insects or the weather, and other hazards like fires. From a public health perspective, we definitely want to minimize these harms. But we're also having to balance what these public health harms are. People have been sharing about the harms of involuntary displacement and encampment sweeps for years. There has been more peer-reviewed scientific evidence emerging in the past couple of years on the topic as well. And from these sources, we know that involuntary displacement introduces a set of new public health harms. And contributions from groups like BHHI on their unsheltered work, as Mark just shared a few minutes ago, further supports these findings. In some instances, involuntary displacement can result in immediate injury or death. Destruction of people's belongings may mean that they lose access to their medications or other survival items, which can really impact health. Being forced to move to new locations can sever connections that folks have with health and social service providers and other outreach teams. Again, this can have negative impacts on our health when people rely on routine care. Tension with others, the stress of having to move, the stress of losing your belongings, all on top of the day-to-day stress of experiencing homelessness can manifest physically in the body and be detrimental for our well-being. Lastly, we have also been seeing associations between involuntary displacement and increases and changes in drug use and overdose. Where this leaves us is needing to minimize the harms of living unsheltered without creating or replicating the harms of involuntary displacement. From a public health perspective, we've really got to think critically about the health risks and threats that are at play here and question when public health rationale is used to justify involuntary displacement. Communities can consider a more humane encampment resolution strategy. So what I'll show on this slide might look visually different than what Mark just presented, but the building blocks are really the same. Given what we know about the social determinants of health and how various social factors act on our health, this approach will likely minimize the harms to health and ensure people's well-being is supported as best as possible. In this strategy, there is emphasis on multi-sector engagement and building relationships that are founded on trust. Public health partners should be represented on multi-sector encampment resolution teams so that any plans, procedures, and actions are considering and accounting for the potential health hazards or harms. For some communities, this may entail public health agencies being the lead convener of the multi-sector encampment response. From a public health perspective, engaging encampment residents, identifying their needs and goals, and assessing the health hazards of where they are currently living are essential. So on this slide where it says assess encampments for health hazards and needs, that does not mean identify hazards and use that to justify sweeping an encampment. The step of assessment is really meant to identify where immediate supports can be provided and how to prioritize where certain resources and services go first. I won't spend too much time talking through the rest of this approach right now, but broadly, the rest of a humane encampment resolution strategy includes identifying available housing units and their features, coordinating housing placements, getting people into housing, continuing engagement for ongoing needs, and then finally, cleaning up the space of the former encampment. The last thing I want to point out here is that a humane encampment resolution strategy takes time. This does not happen overnight or even in a week, and often probably not in 2 weeks. This is a sustained effort that really should be centering relationship building and being responsive to people's specific needs. Please note that the findings and conclusions of this presentation are those of myself and do not necessarily represent the official position of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Thank you all for your time. I am looking forward to our discussion. Now I'd like to hand it over to Carter.
Thank you, Ashley. Hi, everybody. My name is Carter Hewgley. I lead the large-scale encampment resolution work at the County of Los Angeles in the Chief Executive Office. And so I was going to provide sort of a local perspective on how we're effectuating encampment resolution in our communities. So I wanted to begin with a sense of urgency. For those who might not know, the city of Los Angeles, which is the largest of 88 cities in the county of Los Angeles, declared a state of emergency on December 12th of 2022 when Mayor Bass took office. In that declaration of state of emergency, there were several priorities. The very first one, which I've highlighted here, was to really address and decrease the number and size of encampments in the city of Los Angeles. Shortly thereafter, on January 10th, the county also declared a state of emergency on homelessness and listed 4 primary missions, of which, as you can see, also highlighted, reducing encampments to bring unsheltered people indoors was the first of those missions. So the county and the city of Los Angeles have been working under a state of emergency since early 2023 and at the end of 2022, which unlocked several authorities and helped move a lot of things with a greater sense of urgency than it had been moving relative to the issue of unsheltered homelessness. I want to give a little context. I'm going to spend some time talking about 2 specific programs, the Pathway Home program and the Inside Safe initiative, which are very large-scale encampment resolutions program. But before I do that, I want to give you some context for the magnitude of our crisis in Los Angeles County and the many ways in which unsheltered people can connect to interim housing. So the map on the right is obviously a map of LA County. We have 88 cities. We have over 120 unincorporated areas. Every dot that you can see is some sort of encampment, largely just in our unincorporated areas. This doesn't even include all of the homelessness that's happening across our cities. So there is a lot of need. There are also a lot of resolutions that happen. And most people, as you can see on the left side of the screen, over 22,000 people are interacting with the homeless service rehousing system through our regular interim housing. Access through outreach teams to congregate beds. And so I don't want to pretend that what I'm going to present is the only way people come inside. Certainly the largest group of folks that are touching the system are touching the mainstream sort of interim housing system that exists. We do engage in what we describe as non-displacement cleanups or urgent cleanups when some of these public health or flood hazard or fire hazard emergencies are happening. And that does impact about 12,000 folks a year. But the programs that we're going to talk about specifically today are a little bit newer, are more resource intensive, and are really housing focused encampment resolution programs that really are designed to permanently resolve the homelessness for people who have been surviving at these locations. And that's why I'm going to zoom in on Pathway Home and Inside Safe. We have other projects, Every Woman Housed Initiative, other ERF projects going on around the county. And I just wanted to provide that context before I zoom in. So we were really proud to launch in the County of Los Angeles. The Board of Supervisors created the Pathway Home program. They have invested over $100 million into the program through a local revenue measure that we have called Measure H. And what we did is we built an encampment resolution program that really has 5 elements to it. First is obviously encampment resolution, which we've been talking about here. How do you identify those locations and prioritize individuals to voluntarily choose to leave the encampment? As Ashley said, this is not a forced displacement. This is an offer. And what we're offering is a more diversified set of interim housing, which is the second component, where every individual is guaranteed a placement into interim housing that might be more viable for them than maybe other options that they have been presented in the past. Specifically, non-congregate motel-based interim housing is the majority of what we're offering. But we don't stop there. We also make a commitment that we are going to fully connect you to all of the services that you are entitled to and that you might benefit from. So we actually come within 2 or 3 weeks of an encampment resolution. We bring all of the county departments and even our state partners to the hotels, and we get them their benefits. We get them signed up for Medicaid. We talk to them about, we get their ID, anything that we can do that is going to help with housing stability, getting you that job, getting your housing application together. We're going to connect you to those services. But we also don't stop there. We named it Pathway Home so that it really has to be that, a real pathway to a credible permanent housing opportunity. So we pair with this a promise to connect you to housing navigation, to life skills development, to help you transition to living indoors, to find units, to get your application together. And we don't stop there. We actually also fund a time-limited subsidy for people to exit this program and get into permanent housing. We're not going to only offer time-limited subsidy. If there's more that you're eligible for, if you can qualify for a voucher, that's great. We're going to try to get you the most appropriate resource we can to get a funded permanent exit pathway for you, so that you're going from the encampment to permanent housing as soon as possible. We have now done this 19 times, and in the County of Los Angeles, we are largely doing this in partnership with our local jurisdictions. So I've listed on the left, I won't go through the list, but what you'll notice as you look through this list, there are several cities listed here, and the county really can't do this without strong partnerships with our local jurisdictions. We are negotiating the terms of citing motel-based interim housing and who's going to come inside and which encampments are we going to prioritize, and we do that through a framework that you're seeing on the right side of your screen, where it's some of the elements that Marc spoke to, where we're trying to prioritize communities that have been disproportionately impacted by both homelessness and poverty. We're trying to prioritize encampments whose members are groups, encampments whose residents are members of groups that have also been disproportionately impacted by homelessness and poverty. The size and the scale of the encampment is also an important criteria for us. But we can't do it unless there's an available interim housing site. So we look at all of these factors, we look at the potential for elevated harm, we look at the strength of the outreach partners, and that's the sort of magic behind how we come up with our ability to offer this Pathway Home resource in these communities at that particular time. It's a lot of work, but it has really changed the lives of at this point, hundreds, almost 1,000 people. And it has changed the nature of our partnership with the jurisdictions that you see on the left side of your screen. I really want to thank the lead for this program. Kim Barnett on my team leads the Pathway Home program. She does a fantastic job. And in these 19 operations, Kim and her team had been able to move 783 individuals from encampments into interim housing. The team has also been part of removing 496 unsafe, uninhabitable recreational vehicles from the public roadway. And we have gotten 131 people into permanent housing just since this program began last year. Obviously, we wish more people were already in permanent housing, but this rate of progress is slightly more significant than the baseline. And so we're seeing evidence that this model is working, and I couldn't be prouder of the work that Kim and the whole team are doing. We also partner, my team oversees the county's partnership with the City of LA's Inside Safe program. Royce Ortega on my team leads this work and does a fantastic job. Really, we're working on the operational planning of how the county is coordinating with the city, how we're informing our multidisciplinary outreach teams, our mobile medical resources, our mental health supports to be able to be there on the day of and to connect to those residents after they've come into the program. How are we communicating to all the impacted elected officials and residents that this is happening? And how are we doing the same thing we do for Pathway Home for the Inside Safe program, bringing all of the county resources to those motel sites and wrapping those services around Inside Safe participants? As you can see on your screen, there's now over 3,000 Inside Safe participants that have come in from encampments. They've conducted 62 operations. My team has organized over 30 service connection events for those operations to connect those thousands of people to their benefits. So we're very, very proud of the work that's been happening within our Inside Safe collaboration. That's it for me, and I think we're going to turn it over back to Margot.
Great. Thank you so much to our amazing panelists. I'd like to invite all the panelists to turn on their cameras and mics now for our roundtable discussion. And I'm going to start it with you, Ashley. Thinking about public health, how can encampment resolution promote good public health outcomes in addressing unsheltered homelessness?
Thanks for that, Margot. So there's a few different ways to be thinking about this. We know that living unsheltered, as I mentioned, brings risks to health that are avoidable and preventable. And we also know that involuntary displacement brings another set of public health harms. And, emerging scientific studies over the last few years are giving us more insight into how encampment sweeps and involuntary displacement leads to adverse health outcomes. So really, we're not wanting folks to live unsheltered. We're also not wanting them to experience displacement. So encampment resolution strategies like those presented today really meet in the middle and give us the best of both worlds. So people are able to get into housing, ideally, which removes the health harms that come with the experience of homelessness or living unsheltered. And that also avoids creating the harms that we see that come with involuntary displacement. These approaches probably keep people connected to care. In some instances, it gets people connected to new care. In many cases, probably allows people to retain their belongings, and I would guess minimizes additional stress, further supporting trusting and caring relationships. So really, I'm thinking about this as a way to avoid the harms of unsheltered homelessness and avoid the harms of involuntary displacement.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. I'm actually going to give you one more question is how should public health practitioners leverage resources or opportunities to really support encampment residents with services, assistance, or whatever their needs may be?
Great question. Also, a few ways to be thinking about this. So in public health, there are often activities that happen with and without direct engagement with members of the community. So there are things like data and surveillance and monitoring and other coordination work that often happens behind the scenes. But then there's also other activities that public health partners do, like providing testing for things like tuberculosis or sexually transmitted infections and providing vaccinations for things like flu and COVID-19. So there's two ways to be thinking about what public health practitioners can do. I'm thinking about leveraging existing data systems and disease surveillance systems to assess and monitor the health of people experiencing homelessness and living in encampments. I'm also thinking about public health partners coordinating with other community organizations and agencies like harm reduction services, behavioral health services, healthcare for the homeless programs, and using those partners to bring services directly to where people are. Public health can accompany those partners with things like testing and vaccination. I've also heard of some public health departments compiling lists of various health and social services that they know to be available in their community. They can consider making those lists of resources available to encampment residents. And then also public health plays a big role in communication and education. So, both directly and through partners and community groups, public health can communicate about the different health risks that come with living in encampment and about involuntary displacement. They can also educate residents in encampments about different health harms that they may not realize are there, and educate on ways to try to stay as well as possible. The last thing I'll say is that public health agencies can be a part of that assessment phase of encampment resolution strategies. So the tool that you all just put out with the encampment hazard assessment tool, using that and coordinating with other government agencies to prioritize resources and services can be a great place for public health to step in.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Ashley. I'm going to turn to you, Carter, and then also probably to you, Mark. I think a lot of people have questions about operational challenges, like how to actually do this. So the first question I might ask is, given that addressing encampments can certainly bring up political challenges, what are some key strategies that you would recommend to ensure that the needs of people experiencing homelessness are prioritized? And how can communities work to ensure that they uplift equity when having these often charged conversations?
Thank you. I appreciate that question. That's certainly true. There's a lot of big feelings around this issue and around encampments. And I think one thing that I have found unites people who might disagree about where we're focusing or how we're focusing. Unsheltered homelessness is unacceptable to everyone, period. And I think that acknowledgement is something that unites people who might be hesitant to adopt this approach or to be willing to help people in this way with the needs of the people at the encampment, because it's unacceptable to both of them. And so we have found that to be sort of a unifying opening salvo into like, well, then let's help you come up with an alternative, because doing nothing is a 100% failure rate. And then I think the use of specific tools around equity, like we actually have an anti-racism, diversity, and inclusion tool that gives us an equity-based risk score for every census tract. And we analyze that sort of in advance of looking at encampments, looking at communities, looking at where we're going to site interim housing. And it gives us sort of an objective way to say, like, are we really helping a community that has been disproportionately impacted by homelessness and poverty? And are we about to over-concentrate more services and supports in communities that have been doing more than their fair share while other communities haven't done enough? And so leaning into some of those objective tools, like this is what the data shows us about the prevalence of shelter and housing in this community, the absence of it, the prevalence of people who are members of groups that have been disproportionately harmed by systemic racism. That has helped us sort of advance conversations about where we can partner and where we should focus.
Fabulous. Mark, anything to add on to that?
I think, Carter is spot on, right? That like I think oftentimes we start our conversations from presumed difference when I think we all agree that people shouldn't be forced to live outside, right? And so if we start with that premise and then work backwards, right? I really do think that the questions rapidly become operational, and operational questions have answers, right? So yes, like we can absolutely start to ask questions about like, well, are there 6 shelters in one neighborhood and none in another? That's an operational question. And it's an operational question with a pretty clear like next step, right? While again, I do think that like there are always political conversations around the siting of anything. When we start to sort of look at it in the starkest terms, in the black and white, right? That I think begins to drive the conversation forward in a different way. The second thing I would say is that it's really important that we sort of lift up that Carter's work is some of the only consistently successful work in the country, right? Because most people's approach to encampments thus far has been sweeps, and people don't come inside with sweeps, right? They move. And so like what we have seen in communities is like, oh, there's relief for a minute, right, from the housed perspective, but then the encampment pops up down the street because it's the same people. They just had to move, right? And so I would really encourage folks who are in political positions or have access to people with political power to start saying, do you want like a short term, not even a win, right? Like, do you want to be morally compromised because you have committed cruelty in pursuit of maintaining attachment to power, or do you want to solve a problem? Because I think most of us who've gone into civic work of any kind, whether elected, appointed, whatever, went into it because we wanted to solve problems. And that, I think, is where we should start our conversation.
Fabulous. Maybe riffing on that, we are now living in a post Grants Pass world. what legal issues are communities needing to consider regarding encampments in this new space? And I'll send that to either Mark or Carter.
I can start. I sent an email to all of our mayors and city managers in our 88 cities today, and I think the first thing I said was, grants pass is a legal decision. It's not a strategy. And I think what we all have to remember, those of us who are charged with public administration, is that it did not change the constitutional protections around property that unhoused members of our community still have and always have had. And property is hugely important in how we respond to and care for and manage encampment resolutions. And those rights did not change, as nor did many other rights that people still have. That case is very limited. It also did not give cities permission to ignore state and federal obligations around affirmatively furthering fair housing, combating land use and housing discrimination, fulfilling their obligations to develop more affordable housing under the housing element law. So there's lots of reasons why we have to continue to build more capacity for our ability to bring people anywhere and to do that in a way that is not discriminatory. It is also clear in the ruling that you can't enforce anti-camping ordinances only for people experiencing homelessness, and jurisdictions need to keep that in mind.
Fabulous. Mark, anything to add?
I think the only thing that I would add to that is that, I think it's really important that people, having been a policy person for a long time and someone who plays a lawyer on TV, right? Like, the grants pass decision was limited to the cruel and unusual clause in the 14th Amendment, right? That's the Ninth Circuit case that got to the Supreme Court was a ruling on the 14th Amendment's applicability to, right, like whether or not cities and jurisdictions could enforce certain fines or criminal proceedings against folks experiencing homelessness, right? All the other constitutional and civil rights apply still, right? And to be quite candid, like some of the action that I'm seeing from communities across the country is going to get them sued. They don't seem to understand that folks still have all the same property rights. They still have all the same, sort of civil rights that they had before and after the grants pass decision. And so I would urge people, in the same way that a proper resolution takes 6 to 8 weeks, almost anything good takes longer than you want. So do the real analysis on like what actually is legal right now. And right, frankly, again, to Carter's point, a legal decision is not a strategy. So once you hear back from your law department, you still have to sit down and figure out what you're going to do with the information that you just received.
Great, and maybe I'll follow up with that in something that I think a lot of our Q&A are sort of hitting on. And this is for any of the three of you who want to answer it, is both what are the common operational challenges and sticking points that come up in the encampment resolution process, and what are some effective strategies to deal with those common problems? I don't know, Carter, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure, I can go first. Where to focus first? Obviously, I showed a map of LA County with 1 million dots on it, and those dots are representative of tens of thousands of people in need. And obviously, the decision about where we're going to focus these scarce resources is an extremely hard operational challenge. And so what we do is we just relentlessly communicate with those who know their communities the best, which is the people who are elected to represent them, about what are you seeing, what are you hearing, and how do we compare that with the data and evidence about the vulnerability and needs that we see in the encampments. So that's a really hard one, and we have a strategy of sort of relentless check-ins about prioritization. The second one is just capacity. Like, I only have the rooms that I have. And even at an encampment, if I've got 10 rooms, but I've got 11 households, you've got to make some impossible choices. And so we also do that through a unified command structure. There's a clear decision maker, and there's only one person at the end of the day who makes some really hard decisions about how we're going to use scarce capacity. Assessing the quality of interpersonal relationships is a really challenging element of encampment resolution. Before we bring a household inside together, we kind of have imperfect information about whether those folks have a safe relationship. And so going through the process of really trying to ascertain that and creating the capacity to accommodate interpersonal violence, if it happens after you've done an encampment resolution, is something you have to build into the model. So we hold rooms vacant, knowing that some people, after they come inside, that relationship might deteriorate. And then lastly, animals. When I got into homeless services, pets, partners, and possessions was sort of drilled into me. I did not fully appreciate the challenges that animals present, and some impossible choices. We don't have the capacity to bring all the people in with all of their animals. And so there's some very hard choices about how we're going to get all of these animals cared for by the system that is also the animal system doesn't have the capacity to meet all of the needs in our community. So those are huge operational challenges for us.
Yeah, thanks for making it real, Mark. Anything to add?
Yeah, I think one, I would really encourage people to read the resolution document, because I like a number of the questions I think that I'm seeing in the chat are in the document. And of course, like if folks want to reach out afterwards, we can always dig into some specific details. I do think, so I used to do some of the stuff Carter does. And so I think I cannot stress enough that like you don't start an operation without what I call some float, right? Which is like if I see 40 people, I'm gonna budget for 55. Like because something's gonna happen, right? Like a household is gonna uncouple, someone's gonna like I've had people who've been in jail and then they come back to the encampment, right? Like, and I didn't know that they were gonna be there, but they come back and like, hey, this is all my stuff. I've lived here for the last 3 years, right? Well, we have to have a plan for you, right? So you do need to have that operational float. I think the other thing that I would say is that it's really, really important. And I've seen some of these questions in the chat as well. It's really important that we be clear that how we bring people inside is by offering them, and Carter touched on this, like quality placements that are going to help them move on with their lives, right? So we're not saying to people, come into the congregate shelter setting. We're not. That's not a successful strategy. And like, I just need to be really honest that like the number of people who are going to accept a congregate shelter placement is pretty low. You'll get some yeses. You will, because like that's how, sort of probability works. Like everything happens. But like you'll get more no's. And the way to drive up the acceptance rate is to prioritize offering people non-congregate settings. And there's a lot of ways to think about how you set up non-congregate settings, right? Again, that's an operational question. It has a lot of different answers. They're all real. And like those non-congregate settings, right, then need to have really housing focused supports that are going to drive towards housing placement, right? So that's one of the reasons why, like I always say, we want to prioritize housing placement for anyone who can, like we can get it for immediately, right? Like whether or not that's through rapid rehousing, other forms of subsidy, right? As CalAIM begins to implement their sort of like rent assistance programs, right? Like we really want to see people using that to get people into housing as the first option, and then non-congregate shelter as the second option, right? And then having that housing focused service attached to it. The third thing I'll say, because again, I'm also just seeing this in the chat, is like quality of service and quality of setting both matter, right? And when we talk about quality of service, that's when we talk about the metrics that I talked briefly about in my presentation, right? Like even if you're doing resolutions really well, you're bringing lots of people inside, but then they sit in those interim placements for 2 years, you're not doing it right. You're not, right? Because like you need to be turning those rooms over in order to make sure that more folks can continue to come in. And how you're going to do that is by having really quality services attached to those interim placements that are going to be able to identify people's barriers and knock them down quickly to get them into stable long-term housing.
Amazing. We have so many incredible questions, so apologies in advance if we don't get to your question, because we have so many, and hopefully we've been answering some along the way. Ashley, I'm gonna actually, because you've had a few minutes off speaking, want to just throw a really good question to you about a very concrete question. How can public health agencies and managed care plans be more coordinated in their efforts, especially as it relates to ensuring that managed care plan members can access the benefits and services available?
That is a fantastic question. And I'm going to be honest, I don't know a lot about managed care plans. So I don't know that I have anything tangible to offer. But I'm going to put that on my to-do list as something to look into, just because I'm not familiar with the healthcare side of things. So sorry, I can't offer something more tangible.
No, all good. Mark, do you want to take a stab at that question?
I can speak really briefly to it. And actually, Margot, can you give me the question one more time just so I can make sure that I
Yeah, just how do public health agencies and managed care plans coordinate and make sure that managed care plan member beneficiaries can benefit from the services while they're in encampments and things.
Yeah, so the prime for folks who are anywhere that you've got a decent 1115 waiver from across the country, and so if you're in California, you absolutely have this. You need to be thinking about how you use what's called in a lot of jurisdictions foundational community supports. And in California, it's just called community supports, right? Though that suite of services can be deployed to provide housing navigation, housing deposits, right? Lots and lots of sort of functional care coordination stuff that can benefit folks who are living unsheltered. Additionally, right, like really want to be thinking about how you online enhanced care management as a way of making sure that folks are not just getting those foundational community supports, but they're also getting their medical needs met, which I think is connected to that public health concern, right? So if someone has a number of sort of chronic health conditions, et cetera, right, that we would classify as like sort of, public health, yada, 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 it's that enhanced care management that's really going to connect them with the supports that they need.
So I'm going to try to put together a couple of questions here that are coming in with the same theme. And one is, how do we square the circle with the sort of 6 to 8 weeks best practices, Mark, that you mentioned with the current reality of, for instance, the governor's executive order and just widespread community pressure?
I would be super curious to hear what others have to say. I will say, maybe as the person who has a lot of freedom right now, I will say that the question that we should all be asking ourselves is, in the crassest terms, do you want to be successful or do you want to be fast? Because what I'm seeing in communities that have chosen aggressive sweeps, even over before grants pass, right, over the last couple years, is like there's a time limit on that strategy because it just moves people around, right? Like that it is like, again, right, if we take all of the humanity out of it, which is gross, but you can do that operationally and land at the exact same place, right? Which is like setting aside that it's cruel, setting aside that there's like it just is like a trash thing to do to like living people. It is not going to end the problem, right? And if you're responding to political pressure because people are yelling at you about encampments, right, you're not actually solving the problem by executing a sweep strategy. And so when we talk about sort of like how do we square that difference, to me, it really is about saying like, in order to build back public trust, in order to get the public to think that we are worthy of the investment as people stewarding public funds, right? We need to show actual stable success, which means people come inside, they stay inside, their lives get better, and then we do that again tomorrow, right? And if it's slower than we all would like, then that speaks to a need to resource the systems to scale so that they can do it appropriately in the ongoing way necessary, right? But like what we see in jurisdictions like Carter's that are doing things the right way, bringing 1,000 people inside, right? That's a big number. That's success. And that to me says fund that work so that it can happen more robustly and faster, right? As opposed to trying to fund additional sweeps, which are, again, never going to get you the public trust that you're in search of.
Great. I have so many questions. I'm just trying to like figure out ones that are that the most people have asked. I'm going to ask a question about vehicular homelessness, which many people are bringing up because people living in vehicles, cars, through RVs count as unsheltered. Is the approach different? What are successful strategies for encampments or people living, encampments made up of people who are vehicularly homeless.
Do you want me to take this one?
Yeah, go for it.
So yes, I'd say is the approach different? No, we offer them a credible alternative to living in your vehicle, and that's usually a non-congregate option with services and supports and a commitment to help you with permanent housing. So that doesn't differ. What does differ is you own a significant asset that is valuable to you, or you're leasing it, or you're squatting in it, and that introduces a whole realm of property ownership investigations that we do collaboratively with the occupant. I'm so proud of the sheriff host team and the collaborative response model we have in LA County, where when we do an RV focused in-camera resolution, they are going out, building trust with those RV occupants, understanding who owns it, understanding what that vehicle's history is, assessing the safety of that vehicle, partnering with public health to understand the environmental hazards that vehicle is presenting, pumping it out, storing it, towing it, dismantling it, but also doing that in a way that affords the owner of that asset the due process rights that that owner is entitled to. So yes, it includes a whole bunch of work that is relative to the property rights of that owner. But the service model does not change. We are going to bring you into somewhere that is better than this, and we're going to connect you to the services and supports that get you to permanent housing.
Wonderful. In our last 2 minutes, I'm going to try to combine a bunch of questions that are really asking about breaking down silos, whether it's including public health agencies. We have a bunch of questions of like, what is the role of law enforcement in this? And then just about collaboration. I don't know, Ashley, do you want to take the first? And then we will do a quick round robin before we have to wrap up. We could go on for hours.
Thanks, Margot. Yeah, while there are some core essential functions that most and all public health departments do live up to, what public health agencies are capable of doing does depend on the jurisdiction and the resources that they have. But I think some of the things that can be really helpful are thinking about data sharing. So, thinking about housing placements where folks have to have a condition or illness or something, public health can help identify who might qualify for certain housing placements. Also thinking about us, keeping track of the health of people as they're in an encampment, knowing who's there, working with homeless service systems and being able to follow up and find people. So I think there's a number of different ways that can happen. My advice would be to reach out to your public health department with the spirit of collaboration and partnership. So I have a lot more to say, but I'll keep it short.
Thank you all so much. This has been incredible. And I'm really sad to have to wrap this up because I feel like we could go on for another hour. I'd really like to thank all of our incredible panelists and really like to thank all of you for joining us today. Wishing you all a wonderful day. Thank you so much for being with us today.